Greetings and welcome to the Piracy Show. Now, today's episode is coming to you from Lyria. We're trying to get into the spirit of the season a little bit here. We're going to be doing some low-level flight. This is something that, if you're thinking about building a base, this is something that you're concerned about. And this is certainly something that, when you talk about base building on planets, this is the nightmare scenario. You're offline, you're away from your base, and bombers are coming to take out your base. This is the ideal, this is not the ideal, sorry. This is the nightmare scenario that you're living with. Why build a base? Why go to all that expense only to go offline and come back online and find that it has been blown up by malicious players, marauders, griefers, right now, the deck is kind of stacked against you in terms of base building. Let's say CIG implemented base building with 312. You could go to, let's say, ArcCorp, or you could go to, Port Olisar, since Crusader's landing zone is not there yet, or Lorville or wherever. And you could purchase a plot of land for XYZ amount of credits. And you could place facilities at that location. You could pick them off of a computer and it would just place them. After 24 hours, they would appear at that location. And you would have like a quick warp coordinate to that location. So if you understand the game right now, like if you have crime reputation, you're going to see landing sites like Jump Point. You're going to see all kinds of drug labs now. Brio's Breaker Yard, Samson and Son Salvage, these kind of areas you're going to see. But in terms of your own personal landing site, let's say it was implemented where only you or a select few players that you specify could actually see that landing zone. Would you build it? Currently, no. I don't think that it would be a good idea, because it would be prone to getting blown up by players if they found it. Now, finding it is a difficult proposition, because if you're smart and you know what you're looking for and you know where to place it, you're probably going to place it far away from anything that you can quantum directly to. So if you have crime reputation and, your standard coordinates, loaded in for any planet map. So to say like, okay, I've got Shubin, I've got ArcCorp mining and all that, but I also have all the drug labs. If you pick a place that's far away from anything, that means that someone's going to have to manually fly around and explore to find your location. So that kind of works in your favor. But apart from that, in terms of defense, there really isn't much out there. Even if CIG opened up the defense turrets that some landing sites like the bunkers on Hurston have, they're still not all that difficult to deal with. In fact, they're kind of a joke right now. But is it always going to be that way? Think about, if you're playing a traditional survival game, let's say Scum or anything else, DayZ, where you're building a base and then you have to log off and your character is either sleeping in that base or whatever. But other players can now mess with your base. But in Star Citizen, things promise to be a little bit different, because we have this thing called NPCs which you could hire. And I don't think it's inconceivable to say that CIG is going to allow you to hire NPCs to man your base, to operate your facilities. Let's say that you're a pirate or you're a part of some criminal syndicate of one type or another, and you're operating a drug lab here on Lyria. You're going to need people to operate that plant. So obviously you're going to have to hire NPCs for it. What if potentially you purchase 4 or 5 ballistas, which are not all that expensive, and you man them with NPCs and you have them patrol around your base? All of a sudden that defense becomes a little bit more daunting. Now, on the other side of things, let's say you own a legal facility and you're just processing ore. So, if you're out there and you're mining in your, mining ship, and you just want to process your ore real quick because you've got Quantanium, you don't want it to destabilize for a modest fee, you can just actually come to my landing site and process it here. I've already laid out the facilities. it's reasonable to assume that the authorities are going to show up and protect your base after a certain appropriate amount of time once they've been alerted that there's, a criminal action underway. Well, if you have even those basic turrets and maybe a few ballistas patrolling around your landing site, you become a very daunting target for an enemy. You become a very costly target, which means they're going to have to either ramp up and bring some heavy-duty artillery to take you out, or they're going to have to contend with your defenses before they can actually come in and rob your base. And maybe that delay is enough for the UEE military to show up and actually teach them a lesson. Now, in the case of a crime syndicate, that UEE support is, I think we can safely say it's not going to be there. But potentially in an area like Pyro, if you're, paying a certain tithe to a criminal organization in the lore that kind of controls that area, you may get support from them. I mean, it's possible. We don't know exactly how all these things are going to break down, but these are likely outcomes. And so what you quickly realize is that, there are different options. It's not just as simple as, you put up a base, I'm just going to show up and blow up your base. It actually becomes something of a problem for the person wanting to take out your base. How much artillery am I going to have to bring to make sure that I can do this without losses? How much is that going to cost me? How much effort am I going to have to go through to do this? And at the end of the day, is the takeaway going to be enough for me to say that was worth my time? You have to remember that in Star Citizen, people are going to have to factor on the cost of fuel, the cost of ammunition, the cost of repairing their ships. All of these things are actually going to become very serious considerations in the future. And what you want to do is you want to kind of tilt the table in your favor enough that even though they may be able to take you out, the cost of doing so versus the profit for doing it may not be enough to justify it. And then again, we are still talking about large, wide open spaces, and you really don't need that much space to set up just a little mini drug lab. If you think of some of the drug labs that you can visit on, let's say, Yellow right now, they're actually quite small. They're not all that big. Now, we know where they are because, we have criminal reputation. We can see these landing sites. But in the future, your own personal one may not show up on the map. And you have to admit that these are fairly huge areas to contend with. So if you build small and you build reasonable, it's not unlikely that someone could fly by your base. Make sure you have your external lights off, though. But it's not unreasonable to expect that people would fly by your base and not even see it. Now, in the future, with scanning and exploration ships and that system being fleshed out, it might be easier to find you. But so far, CIG has not said anything about us maybe not being able to set up a base, let's say, in an asteroid. Now, something to the scale of Grim Hex, I think most players would agree would probably be fairly unreasonable, though I do have to kind of highlight one of my expectations is that when we get to Pyro, is that there are going to be locations like Grim Hex, because remember, Pyro is a system that was mined out, that was cleared out, just totally wiped out of resources, but the infrastructure, the abandoned infrastructure, is still there. So I bet you there's going to be places like Grim Hex that players are going to fight over to kind of control with their criminal syndicate. So if you have a high profile criminal syndicate, chances are this is going to be one of these locations that you fight over, much like some of the bases out in 0-0 in EVE Online. These are going to be areas that are going to be contested all the time, and people are going to fight for control of the market and the resources in that area. But I don't think it's unreasonable to expect that we may find some abandoned locations like this that aren't marked on the map that players could possibly use as a personal safe space, so to speak, or that we can, just plunk down base facilities on the surface of an asteroid so long as it has a certain mass. and we can anchor those facilities to that asteroid. Maybe a landing pad, a little storage area, and a crew quarters where you can store certain things for your characters, and that landing pad maybe has some adjacent fuel tanks that you need to supply, things like that. It's not unreasonable to assume that these things are going to exist in Star Citizen, and one of the things that you kind of realize is that space is a really big place. And when you're talking about scanning the entire surface of a moon in, within a planetary system, that's not entirely unreasonable to expect a player to do, but to check every asteroid in a solar system, and maybe even not accounting for what isn't in an asteroid belt, but what might be floating freely out there that you might be able to find. I think that once we start getting into multiple solar systems and players start spreading out and exploring, that it's going to be a lot easier to find places like this, whether it's on the surface of a moon or on a planet or out on an asteroid, that other players are going to have a real problem trying to find. Some players may stumble over it accidentally and not know what it is, but chances are you might be able to find a space, if you're willing to fly out far enough looking for it, that other players are going to have a hell of a time finding. It's not going to guarantee that you're never going to be found, but it may be enough to guarantee that it's unlikely that you're going to be found. Now, if you have a larger org, like if you're in one of these orgs that has mega members, and so you've people around the world, there's always people online to defend your base, building a large facility or controlling a facility is probably going to be a lot easier to do. But if you're like myself and you're in a smaller org, then chances are you might think, well, if most of you guys are in the NA time zone, then that could be problematic for defending your location 24/7. But if you keep things reasonable, if you keep your expectations reasonable and you kind of go, okay, what do we really need? Let's say, for instance, that we can get a drug refining lab up. Let's just say that that's one of the things that we can do. And I don't think that that's unreasonable to assume. So let's say players in your org, they pool together a bunch of money. They don't actually buy land, but they go to some place where it's unregulated and they plunk down a small refinery station. Now, players can go to places like, Boundless Harvest or Galit Farms, and they can buy Revenant Tree pollen. And maybe they have to buy a few other chemicals to mix with it. They bring it to the lab. They refine it into drugs. They take it, they put it on the market, and it sells out via the new cargo system where we can actually store cargo in locations. And this becomes a main source of income for, let's say, a small smuggling syndicate. Now, the facility itself it's there as something that, the guild or the org will keep a small tithe of whatever they refine to pay for the facilities and to pay for eventually having to set them up again. But you don't have to set up something all that big, and it just becomes a resource that players in your org can use. They can travel to, and they say, oh, here's my hydrogen, let's just say, and here's my, Revenant Tree pollen. Make me Slam, make me Widow, whatever. And they make it, they sell it on the market, bang, they're making money. And this becomes one of the ways that they generate cash. The facility eventually gets found and raided at some point. Who cares? Set up another one. Because if you're doing it smartly and you're doing it right, then it'll probably have paid for itself already, if the org is being smart about it. Now, you can get unlucky, but you may be able to run out of that location for weeks, if not months, depending on how well you hide it in maybe a little canyon somewhere or behind a mountain where someone is unlikely to see it. There's a lot of things that we don't know. So a lot of this is just speculation. And I'm just kind of pulling some of this out of my ass, so to speak. But it's not unreasonable to assume that these things are going to be here. I mean, Revenant Tree pollen is, in fact, it is something that you can purchase in the game right now. There are many chemicals that you can purchase in the game right now. And we do know that drug labs are going to be a thing. It's one of the unintended features of the endeavor that CIG has spoken about. So you put these things together and you can say, okay, I can see how players could reasonably build a drug lab. And if your org uses it as just a refining facility to make stuff and then go out and put it on the market and sell it, it's not unreasonable to assume that you could use this to make money, and eventually you could probably make enough money to pay for that facility again and then set it up someplace else if it gets found or if it gets raided. So it's really no big problem. I mean, even if somebody finds it and blows it up, chances are the players that are using it are, putting in the input, taking out the output, and leaving nothing there behind for anyone else to steal. So what do you really lose? It may not be all that much. One of the biggest errors that I see, one of the biggest errors in judgment that I see for players when they're playing a game like Scum or any other survival game where you build a base that persists even when you're logged off, Conan being another example. One of the biggest mistakes I see players make is that oftentimes, and I'm certainly guilty of it too, is that we build facilities that are way too grandiose and way too massive and too easy to find in games like this. We never really think of, being smart about it and hiding our bases and making facilities minimal. We tend to go for things like, I want to be able to, process, 10,000 iron in less than an hour, so I need 80 furnaces and I need this and I need that, and we build these huge grandiose castles to show our greatness and our creativity. But when you're in a survival game and your facility always stands a chance of being raided or destroyed or stolen, there are people who just go like, my base got destroyed, I quit, this sucks, Whereas there are other people who build reasonably, and they build a few smaller things and they hide them in places where they're unlikely to be found. And generally those are the players that tend to do well and survive over the long term. So even though, there's always going to be the lingering threat of your facility being destroyed, raided, robbed, whatever. That's certainly going to be present in, almost hit the ground there, Star Citizen. But if you're on the legal side of things, chances are maybe you can build a defense that can hold people off long enough for the UEE to show up. But any way you really cut it, if you're reasonable about things and you're smart about things and you're not sitting there and saying, I'm going to put all my eggs in one basket and I'm going to store all my cargo here on this moon out, in the middle of nowhere. If you're smart about how you manage these facilities and these things, it's not all that big of a problem, and it's not something to worry about all that much. And one of the things that I keep trying to remind people of is that yes, you're vulnerable, but it really is a big world out there, something that we talked about very recently in a video. These are big worlds, and it's easy to kind of get a little carried away with the idea that, my stuff's going to be destroyed, all my stuff's going to be destroyed. But if people really want to destroy your base, you just make it hard to find. Make it the proverbial needle in a haystack.
Thank you for watching. So if you want to keep up with the latest and greatest in Star Citizen and Squadron 42's development, please follow us on our social media channels. See you soon.